You're just a waitress. Know your place." The sentence didn't echo, it detonated, slicing through the low hum of a $2 million private dinner high above Manhattan, where crystal glasses caught the amber light, and every chair held someone used to being obeyed. Forks froze midair, conversations died mid-word, and for a brief second, the entire room held its breath as Jonathan Reed leaned back in his chair, calm, composed, untouchable. The kind of man who built empires with a phone call and ended careers with a glance, his tailored suit flawless, his confidence louder than any voice in the room, and standing beside him, barely acknowledged until now, was Naomi Carter, 26, black uniform pressed, posture straight, hands steady despite the weight of a silver tray. She had carried through rooms like this 1,000 times, rooms where people like her were expected to move quietly, speak softly, and disappear completely, and for a moment, it looked like she would do exactly that again. Her eyes lowered, her voice calm as she said, "I'm sorry, sir." The kind of apology that kept shifts smooth and tips intact, the kind that made powerful men feel even more powerful. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others smirked behind their glasses, because this was familiar, this was expected, this was how the world worked. But what none of them noticed, not the investors, not the assistants, not even Jonathan, was the way Naomi's eyes moved, not nervously, not submissively, but precisely, scanning documents left open on the table, catching fragments of conversation, numbers, clauses, details whispered between men who thought no one else was listening. Because Naomi had learned something long before this night. Invisibility wasn't weakness, it was access, and access, if used right, could become power. Jonathan reached for his glass again, dismissing her with a flick of his fingers like she was part of the furniture, already turning back to the deal, already certain the room belonged to him. And that was when Naomi leaned in just slightly, close enough that only he could hear, her voice still soft, still respectful, but carrying something else now, something steady, something dangerous. "Sir, are you sure you want to finalize this offer?" Jonathan paused, barely, just a flicker, the smallest crack in an otherwise perfect rhythm. He didn't look at her, not yet, but something in the tone made him hesitate, just for a second, the kind of second that doesn't mean anything until it does, because what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Naomi Carter had already seen the one detail that could unravel everything. Jonathan Reed did not like hesitation, not in others, and certainly not in himself. But that single question lingered longer than it should have, like a faint crack beneath polished marble. He slowly turned his head, just enough to finally look at her, really look at her, as if trying to understand why a waitress would dare interrupt the flow of a deal worth over $2 billion. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the same look that had closed mergers and dismantled competitors. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, the kind that made people step back without realizing it. But Naomi did not step back. She did not raise her voice either. She simply met his gaze for a fraction of a second before lowering it again. Perfectly professional, perfectly composed. "I only meant, sir, that some details may need a second look," she said. And to anyone else in the room, it sounded harmless, even helpful. But Jonathan heard something else, something precise, something intentional. Around them, the room began to breathe again. Conversations cautiously resumed. A glass clinked. A quiet laugh tried to patch over the tension, but the rhythm was off now, just slightly, like music that had missed a beat. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, dismissing it outwardly. Yet his fingers paused on the edge of the contract. The document spread across the table between him and the investors, pages filled with numbers, clauses, signatures waiting to happen. He had reviewed it twice, his legal team 3 times. There was nothing left to question. There never was. And yet, which detail? He asked, almost casually, as if indulging a minor distraction. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached forward just enough to adjust a glass that did not need adjusting, her movement smooth, invisible to most, but deliberate, placing her exactly where she needed to be, close enough to the document, close enough to be heard without drawing attention. "Clause 14, sir," she said quietly. The timing condition tied to the overseas subsidiary. Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Clause 14, he knew every line of that contract. Every word had been negotiated, refined, secured. He leaned forward now, his confidence still intact, but no longer effortless, his eyes scanning the page, landing exactly where she had pointed without pointing. And for the first time that night, he read it not as a formality, but as a question. The room did not notice the shift immediately, but one of the junior analysts did, then another, a subtle chain reaction, eyes drifting toward the table, sensing something had changed. Even if they could not yet name it, Naomi stepped back again, returning to her place beside the table, silent, composed, just another server waiting to be dismissed. But the silence she left behind was different now. Heavier, sharper. Jonathan's finger traced a single line of text. Once, then again, slower this time, and the faintest flicker crossed his expression. Not doubt, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes just before everything tilts. And somewhere across the table, one of the investors leaned forward slightly, watching, because power had not left the room. But for the first time that night, it had begun to move. Jonathan Reed read the line again, slower this time. Each word no longer part of a routine, but a potential fracture. The clause was simple on the surface, a timing condition tied to an overseas subsidiary, standard language, something he had seen 100 times before. And yet something about the phrasing felt off now, not wrong, but misaligned, like a lock. That almost fit the key, but not quite. His fingers stopped midway across the sentence. And for the first time that evening, he did not look like the man who controlled the outcome. Across the table, the lead investor, Daniel Whitmore, noticed it immediately. His posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that signaled attention, not courtesy, but interest. "Is there a problem, Jonathan?" Daniel asked, his tone calm, measured, but carrying the weight of someone who did not ask unnecessary questions. Jonathan did not answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the contract, his mind recalculating. Clause 14 tied the final transfer of equity to a regulatory approval window, but the window was defined by a jurisdiction that had recently updated its compliance timeline. A detail small enough to overlook, large enough to matter. If the approval did not align exactly as written, the entire deal could stall, or worse, collapse under its own conditions. And that risk had not been priced in, not discussed, not even acknowledged. A faint murmur rippled through the table as another advisor leaned in, scanning the same section. Then another. The quiet confidence that had filled the room minutes ago began to thin, replaced by something sharper, something uncertain. Jonathan finally leaned back. But it was not the same movement as before. It lacked the ease, the certainty. His jaw tightened slightly as he looked up, not at Naomi this time, but at Daniel. "It is a minor detail," he said, but the word minor did not land the way he intended, because now the room was listening differently. Daniel extended his hand toward the document. "May I?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The paper slid across the table, and with it, the balance of control. Naomi stood where she had always stood, just outside the circle of power, but no longer invisible, not to those who were paying attention. Daniel adjusted his glasses, reading carefully, his silence stretching just long enough to shift the atmosphere again. Then he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition. "This clause," he said, tapping the page lightly, "could invalidate the entire execution timeline if the approval extends beyond 30 days. The words landed heavier than any insult, because they were precise, undeniable, real. One of the junior lawyers nodded almost instinctively, then quickly looked down, as if realizing too late that he had just confirmed something out loud. Jonathan's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the effort of regaining ground. "We can amend it," he replied, but now it sounded reactive, not strategic. Daniel leaned back, studying him, then glanced briefly toward Naomi, just for a second, enough to acknowledge, not her role, but her presence. "Perhaps," Daniel said, "but it raises a larger question." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "How did we all miss it?" The room went still again, not frozen this time, but focused, because the question was no longer about a clause. It was about awareness, about who was paying attention and who was not. And standing quietly beside the table, Naomi Carter adjusted the edge of her tray, her expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. but the truth had already moved through the room, and it was not going back. The silence did not break. It shifted, tightening around the table like an invisible thread, pulling every eye back to the contract, back to the man who was supposed to control it. Jonathan Reed straightened in his chair, shoulders squared, expression sharpened into something practiced, something deliberate, the version of himself that had walked into this room expecting nothing but agreement. "We revise the clause, extend the window, and proceed," he said, voice steady, authoritative as if the solution had always been part of the plan, as if nothing had been missed at all. But the words did not land cleanly. Not anymore. Daniel Whitmore did not nod, did not immediately agree. Instead, he leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, studying Jonathan with a patience that felt heavier than pressure, because patience meant he was thinking, and thinking meant the deal was no longer moving forward. It was being reconsidered. "You are suggesting we adjust a core condition after signing." "Review," Daniel said calmly, not accusing, not emotional, just precise. And precision in rooms like this was more powerful than volume. A few seats down, another investor shifted, glancing again at the clause, then at Jonathan, then briefly, almost instinctively, toward Naomi, as if trying to understand how the smallest voice in the room had redirected the largest conversation. Jonathan followed that glance without meaning to, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes landing on Naomi where she stood, still, composed, her presence unchanged, but now impossible to ignore. And in that moment, something unfamiliar crossed his expression, not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition, the realization that control had not been taken from him. It had slipped, quietly, precisely, the way a detail slips through a contract when no one is paying attention. He looked back at Daniel, regaining his tone. "It is still a strong deal," he said, but the certainty was thinner now, stretched. Daniel nodded once, slowly. "It was," he replied, the past tense settling over the table like a shadow. A pause followed, not long, but long enough for everyone to feel it, long enough for the weight of possibility to turn into the weight of consequence. One of the legal advisors cleared his throat softly. "If the clause triggers a delay, the valuation exposure increases significantly," he said, careful, measured. But the implication was clear. Risk had entered the room, and once risk was visible, it could not be unseen. Jonathan's hand rested flat on the table now, no longer gesturing, no longer directing, just still, as if anchoring himself to a moment that was already moving away, across from him. Daniel closed the folder halfway, not fully, not decisively, but enough to signal hesitation, enough to change the trajectory of everything that had been building toward this signature. And then, almost casually, but not without meaning, Daniel spoke again. "Who noticed this?" he asked, his eyes scanning the table, the lawyers, the advisors, the executives, each one avoiding the question in their own way, because the answer was already known, even if it had not been said out loud. The room did not need confirmation, it needed acknowledgement, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Daniel's gaze shifted to the side, landing on Naomi Carter, standing with a tray that now felt heavier than anything else in the room. And for the first time that night, no one looked past her. No one dismissed her, because the balance had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And Jonathan Reed, the man who had owned the room, sat there in silence, realizing that the smallest voice had just rewritten the outcome. No one spoke immediately, not because there was nothing to say, but because the room was recalibrating, quietly, carefully, like a machine adjusting after a fault it did not expect. Daniel Whitmore's gaze remained on Naomi for a moment longer than necessary. Not intrusive, not performative, just acknowledging the source of the shift. Then he looked back at Jonathan Reed, and in that simple movement, the hierarchy in the room rewrote itself, not announced, not voted on, just understood. "Miss," Daniel said, his voice calm, respectful, cutting cleanly through the silence. "Would you mind clarifying what you saw?" The question landed differently than any before it, because it did not dismiss, it invited, and invitations in rooms like this were a form of power. Naomi did not react immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. She placed the tray gently on a nearby stand, her movements precise, unhurried. the same way she had carried herself all evening. But now every step was visible, every gesture noted. She stepped closer to the table, not into the center, but close enough to be heard without raising her voice. The clause ties execution to a regulatory window that has already been extended beyond the stated timeline, she said, her tone even, clear, not trying to impress, not trying to prove, just stating what was there. If the approval does not align exactly, the equity transfer cannot legally proceed as written. A quiet murmur followed, not confusion this time, but confirmation. One of the attorneys nodded again, slower now, more deliberate, as if aligning his understanding with what had just been said out loud. Jonathan watched her closely, his expression no longer dismissive, but searching, measuring, trying to place her within a framework that made sense, because this version of her did not fit the one he had created moments earlier. "And you are certain?" he asked, the question controlled, but no longer casual. Naomi met his gaze briefly, just long enough to answer without challenge. "Yes, sir," she said. "It is already reflected in the updated filing from last quarter." The precision of the answer settled into the room like fact, not opinion, not interpretation, fact. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer subtle. "You have seen the filing?" he asked, not doubting, but confirming. Naomi nodded once. "I follow regulatory updates closely," she replied, simple, direct, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary, because the truth did not need decoration. Across the table, someone exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that signaled a decision forming, not yet spoken, but already moving. Jonathan leaned back again, but this time the movement carried weight, not confidence, his mind working through the implications, the missed detail, the shifting control, the presence of someone he had dismissed without a second thought, now standing at the center of a conversation that determined millions, if not billions. And for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would restore the version of the room that existed before she spoke. Daniel closed the folder. Fully this time, the soft sound echoing louder than it should have. "We will need to reassess," he said, not dramatically, not emotionally, just final enough to change everything. The words did not crash, they settled, heavy, undeniable, and Naomi Carter, standing beside the table, did not smile, did not react. She simply stepped back, returning to her place, but it was no longer the same place. Because now everyone in the room knew exactly who she was, not by title, not by status, but by something far more difficult to ignore. She was the one who saw what they did not. The word reassess did not echo. It settled, heavy and irreversible, like a door closing softly but completely. And in rooms like this, doors did not need to slam to end something. Jonathan Reed felt it before anyone said another word. The deal was no longer his to command. It had slipped into a space where control was shared, questioned, redistributed, and that was a space he rarely occupied. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore rested his hands calmly on the closed folder, his decision not rushed, not emotional, but anchored in something far more dangerous to Jonathan than confrontation, clarity. "We will pause here," Daniel said, his tone even, final without force. A few advisors nodded immediately, others followed, not because they were told to, but because the direction was already clear. Momentum had shifted, and no one in that room wanted to move against it. Jonathan exhaled. Slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the effort it took to remain composed. "A pause is unnecessary," he replied, his voice still controlled, still deliberate, but no longer carrying the same weight it had minutes ago, because now every word he spoke was measured against the silence that followed Naomi's. Daniel tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just certain. "A pause is responsible," he corrected, and the distinction landed sharper than any argument. Because responsibility in that room meant protection of capital, of reputation, of leverage, and for the first time that evening, Jonathan was not the one defining those terms. A quiet shuffle of chairs followed, subtle but unmistakable. One investor leaned back, another closed his tablet, a third exchanged a glance with his legal counsel. These were not dramatic gestures, but in high-level negotiations. They were decisive. They signaled withdrawal, recalculation, distance, and Jonathan saw it all, not as separate actions, but as a pattern forming, a pattern he had built his career reading in others, now reflected back at him. He glanced once more toward Naomi, not with the dismissiveness from before, but with a question he could not fully articulate. How did she see it? How did she catch what his entire team did not? But Naomi was no longer part of the conversation in the way he understood. She had already done what she came to do, whether by design or by instinct. And now she stood quietly again, hands steady, posture unchanged, as if the outcome unfolding around her had nothing to do with her at all. Daniel stood up slowly, not abruptly, but with the kind of calm authority that did not require explanation. "We will revisit once the terms reflect current conditions," he said, extending a hand toward Jonathan, not as agreement, but as closure for the moment. Jonathan stood as well, because standing was expected, because posture still mattered, but the exchange was different now, the handshake brief, formal, lacking the unspoken alignment it was meant to symbolize. Around them, the room began to move again, softly, carefully, like a system restarting after a disruption. Conversations resumed in lower tones, glasses were lifted again, but the energy had changed. It no longer belonged to one man. It no longer followed one direction. And as Jonathan stepped back from the table, the space he left behind did not feel like absence. It felt like transition, because the room had already adjusted to a new center, and standing just outside of it, Naomi Carter reached for her tray once more, her movements as precise as before. But now, every person in that room knew something they had not known an hour ago. Power was not always the loudest voice at the table. Sometimes, it was the one that spoke only once and changed everything. The room did not return to what it was, it adjusted around what had just happened. Conversations resumed, but softer now, more careful, like everyone was aware that something invisible had shifted and could shift again at any moment. Jonathan Reed stepped away from the table with measured control, each step deliberate, each breath steady. But inside, the calculation had not stopped, it had only intensified. He had built his reputation on reading rooms faster than anyone else, on catching what others missed, and yet tonight, the one detail that mattered most had not just slipped past him. It had been caught by someone he had already dismissed, and that realization did not sit quietly. It pressed, sharp and persistent, across the room. Daniel Whitmore spoke in low tones with his advisors, their heads close together, not secretive, but focused, already restructuring the conversation without Jonathan at the center of it. And that was the difference. Not the pause, not the delay, but the repositioning. Jonathan was no longer the axis. He was now one of many variables, and variables could be replaced, refined, or removed. He stopped near the edge of the room, just beyond the immediate circle of influence, where the city lights stretched across the glass walls like a silent reminder of everything he still controlled, everything he had built. But even that view felt slightly different now, less like a confirmation, more like a question. He turned his head, not toward the investors, not toward the contract, but toward Naomi Carter. She was moving again, quiet, efficient, carrying a tray past a group of guests who now stepped aside just a fraction sooner than before, acknowledging her presence in ways they had not minutes ago, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but real. And Jonathan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, not out of curiosity alone, but because he needed to understand, needed to place her within the framework he used to make sense of people. But she did not fit. She was not trying to be seen, not trying to leverage the moment, not even looking in his direction, and that made it harder, because there was no obvious intention to read, no performance to analyze, just quiet certainty. He walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to close the distance without drawing attention. "Naomi," he said, her name measured, controlled, but different now, not dismissive, not casual. She paused, turning to face him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the conversation had always been expected. "Yes, sir," she replied, the same professionalism, the same tone, but now it carried something else, something that no longer placed her beneath him. Jonathan held her gaze for a second, longer than he had allowed himself before. "You read regulatory filings," he said, not as a question, but as a statement he was still trying to confirm in his own mind. Naomi nodded slightly. "Yes, sir," she answered. Simple, direct. Jonathan exhaled quietly, the smallest release of tension. That is not typical for someone in your position, he added, and this time, it was a question, even if it did not sound like one. Naomi's response came without hesitation. I do not limit myself to the position others assign to me, she said, her voice steady, not defensive, not proud, just clear, and for a moment, Jonathan said nothing, because there was nothing in that sentence he could challenge, nothing he could reframe. It simply existed, and it was enough. Across the room, Daniel's voice rose slightly as he addressed the group again, the conversation moving forward without Jonathan's input, and that was the final confirmation. The room had moved on, not permanently, not irreversibly, but enough. Jonathan glanced back once, then returned his attention to Naomi, and in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined the beginning of the night no longer applied, because the man who had once dismissed her now stood there, not in control, not in command, but in understanding that the person he had overlooked was the one who had changed everything. Jonathan Reed stood there for a moment longer than he should have, the weight of the night settling into something quieter, something harder to ignore, because it was no longer about the deal, not entirely. It was about what had been revealed in the space between words, the space he had always believed he controlled. He looked at Naomi again, not as an interruption, not as a variable, but as a fixed point he had failed to see. You changed the trajectory of that room, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. Naomi did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she did not carry the need to fill silence. She simply met his gaze for a brief second, then looked past him, as if the moment did not belong to either of them alone. The room was already moving, she replied, calm, precise. I just pointed to something it was not ready to see. Jonathan let that settle, because it reframed everything. It removed intention, removed ego, left only awareness. And awareness was something he respected, even when it came from a place he had overlooked. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore's voice carried again, steady, composed, outlining next steps with his team, timelines, reassessments, alternatives, the language of forward motion without commitment, the kind that kept options open and leverage intact. And Jonathan knew that tone. He had used it himself countless times, usually from the other side of the table. Now he was hearing it directed around him, not against him, but not with him either, and that distinction mattered more than any direct rejection. He glanced back once more, watching as the conversation continued without pause, without him, and for the first time that night, he did not try to interrupt it, did not try to reclaim it, because he understood something now that he had not before. Control was not always taken. Sometimes it was simply not given. He turned back to Naomi, his expression steady, but changed. You are not just observing, he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi adjusted the edge of her tray slightly, her movements still, measured, still grounded. No one is just observing, she answered. Some people are just not being listened to. The sentence landed quietly, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said earlier, because it did not challenge him, it reflected him, and Jonathan nodded once, not in agreement, not fully, but in acknowledgement, the kind that marked a shift that could not be undone. A server passed behind Naomi, the rhythm of the room continuing around them, but the space between them remained still, as if time had slowed just enough to make the moment clear. If you were in my position, Jonathan said after a pause, his tone controlled but no longer distant, what would you do next? It was a question he rarely asked, not because he lacked curiosity, but because he rarely needed to. Naomi considered it for a second, not long, just enough to answer without rushing. I would listen to the people who saw what I missed, she said, her voice steady. And I would ask why I did not see it sooner. Jonathan held her gaze again, and this time, there was no attempt to measure, no attempt to categorize, just understanding forming where certainty had been. Across the room, Daniel closed another folder, signaling the next phase of the evening, and Jonathan knew that whatever came next would not look like what he had planned, but it would be shaped by what he had learned. And as Naomi stepped back into motion once more, disappearing into the flow of the room that had once overlooked her, Jonathan Reed remained where he was for a second longer, not because he was lost, but because he was recalibrating. And for a man who had built everything on control, that moment of recalibration was not weakness, It was the beginning of something far more difficult. Awareness. The night did not end with applause. It ended with quiet decisions, the kind that never made headlines but reshaped everything that followed. Jonathan Reed did not return to the table immediately. He watched from a distance as the conversation continued without him. Not chaotic, not broken, just redirected. And in that redirection, he saw something clearer than any contract. Power had not disappeared. It had simply found a new balance, one that did not revolve around him alone. Across the room, Daniel announced. It needed to be understood. Jonathan stepped out into the night, the cool air meeting him with a clarity that matched his thoughts. The deal was not lost, not entirely, but it was no longer what it had been, and neither was he, because somewhere between a single sentence and a single detail, something had shifted, something he could not undo and would not ignore. And inside that room, Naomi Carter continued her work, unnoticed by some, seen by others, but unchanged in the way that mattered most. She did not raise her voice. She did not claim the moment. She did not need to, because the truth had already moved through the room, and it carried her with it. And in the quiet space left behind, one lesson remained, steady and undeniable. The people you overlook are often the ones who see everything. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice, spoken at the right moment, to change the direction of power itself.